an interesting idea that someone had on the net that I'm going to bring up because I've only found one reference to it. Let's go back in the before time. Guns N Ammo magazine, 1969. Rimming the Rimless by Duncan A. Douglas Jr. He tried to find or make brass cases for a Louis Christophe double rifle that had been drill chambered out to what he said was 410 shotgun shells, which if you're not aware of it, I'm very familiar with. The general thing you find with them is anyway, it had a bore diameter or a bullet diameter that he guesstimated, or it was written on it, didn't specify, of being 42.5 caliber, 0.425 inches, declared, I guess. Now, he was inspired by a 1967 book, Home Guide to Cartridge Conversions, by Major George Charles Nonte, Jr. So he had it sleeved back down to a chamber diameter that was smaller that he could then re-drill to some other cartridge. And he decided to start over with the 30-06 brass case and add a rim to it so he could make it chamber correctly. Now, there are cartridges that are around 2.5-ish that would work. And he described a whole process by which he decided to use 30-06 brass and add a rim to it. The way he did it was, instead of the squared off edge of the extractor groove that's milled in by when they make them, or at least cleaned up that way when they form them, he would cut it into a wedge shape like that, grinding out extra metal, drop a brass ring, a very, very annealed brass ring, soft brass, over the bottom of it, and then mash it down with a piece of tubing that had a wedge shape on the inside like this, so it would push down and squeeze the metal from being kind of square in, and then further press it down to make it flat rim-like, and then mill it down on a lathe or whatever to make the brass. If you're not aware of it, a lot of people have tried to convert, let's say, 50 BMG cartridges to 12-gauge shells because they're full brass and it's kind of cool looking, a big crazy looking bullet. And other things like this. Putting a rim onto a cartridge is very difficult compared to removing a rim. And this is an interesting story, and I was going to look up how to do this, but I couldn't find any other sources. And the Home Guide to Cartridge Conversions, a book that goes for anywhere from, 110 up, isn't going to be on my list of things I'm going to be getting hold of, downloading, or buying this week, so that's out. But I wanted to address something simple here. The double rifle from Louis Christophe, they're only listed as chambered for contemporary things like 450 Black Powder Express and the Gruendig cases, which came as rimmed and non-rimmed, and also rebated rim, any kind of variety you wanted to, at 10.75 millimeter by 52 millimeter long rimmed cases and non-rimmed cases. Now, remember he said that his gun was 42.5 caliber. Well, we have 42.2 caliber for just the mouth diameter on the outside of that case, and the base being 0.49 inches. 0.48 and 0.47 are the ranges within you're able to have a 410 shotgun shell in. It's 0.47 normally. Obviously, because that's what it's supposed to be, but people will overbore them so they can stick in a 45 Colt. The bullet diameter for this thing is supposed to be 424, which means it's a little smaller than what he measured the bore at the muzzle most likely at, which means it might have been a burnt or blown out barrel. But the bullet diameter is also listed as 0.423 inches, so smaller. The neck diameters are almost always listed as 0.45, which is what he was going for. So it might have been the Gruendig. The neck diameter being 0.48 for a Black Powder Express, 0.47 for neck diameter. Says it probably wasn't the Black Powder Express, even though that was somewhat more popular for double rifles for Louis Christophe in the era that we're talking about, of what he's describing, kind of, in the article. So anyway, I wonder if his assumption that it was chambered for 410 was accurate at all, because he's describing something he had to sleeve down to a base diameter for a 30-06 to work, and that doesn't match it being reamed out, or as he said, rusty drill bit reamed, or rusty drill bit chambered out to a 410 cartridge, so I'm not sure what's going on here. But anyway, it's an interesting subject. How would you attach a rim to a cartridge? Now, if you're not aware of it, in a firearm, the ideal is to make it to where, well, it isn't going to happen this way, but the ideal is to make it to where if you put a cartridge into a gun and simply hold it in place and ding the back of it, depending on the cartridge type, that it should almost hold itself in place from the explosion and not shoot out. That's not really what happens in practice, but you'll see a lot of designs where they try to get it so close to being able to do that. The idea is to make sure that all of the pressures and stresses are applied very evenly and very safely, so that you have plenty of margin for error and script factor, just in case you get an overpressure round or bad ammo or whatever, or bore obstruction. And the other ideal of it is, if possible, all the wear and tear should be dumped to the casing, so that when it's spent, it can be damaged, it doesn't matter. Shotgun shells, taking the brutalization of the gun going off by having that rim, on a shotgun cartridge for instance, basically acting like a metallic gas-tight seal that is expendable. So they should be slightly squeezed in place, unless it's a rimfire, in which case that would just set it off. And that was the attitude for a lot of double rifles. They would make everything about the case the thing that would take the abuse. And the gun would just have to maintain itself for thousands of shots, or hundreds of thousands, depending. Double rifles are extremely overpressure firearms in most cases. So the idea that someone would take something and, oh, well, we don't have the cartridges anymore. He didn't state what the cartridge was written on it. Most guns had the listing of what it was. And he was able to figure out the caliber at .425 inches. So my assumption at this point is it sounds like, and I'm saying this about a story from 1969, 1 year less old than me. It sounds like a fishing story. But what could cause this? Well, how many outdated cartridges exist that were only made for a short period of time from one company to supply with their guns? And yeah, Louis Christophe is a company that made lots of firearms, custom ones, for whatever brass you had laying around or whatever the cartridge was. Some of you who watch my channel might remember that I do videos on obscure and weird firearms cartridges. In India, they have a cartridge type that's only available in India, it seems. It's not really. It's kind of a bastardization of somebody else's cartridges to make it easier to produce them, so that they can have a highly regulated but well-armed population. If you want a rifle, it'll be a rifle that's got limited range, but you can tune it up. It's of limited utility unless you futz with it. It's eminently practical for hunting for the purpose of eating, or for dispatching an animal if you're going to slaughter it, or if you have to because it's damaged too much and you want to put it out of its misery, and also for self-defense. And looking that one up, you find that India and virtually everybody involved in it keeps the information about that rifle a secret. People make pistols for that cartridge by making their own barrels out of random pipe because it just happens to fit a specific piece of tubing that is commonly available specifically in India. So you knew I dug more. There are about a dozen cartridges that could be an easy candidate for this that were .42 caliber but called .45 when they weren't .45. That were around 10 millimeter. 10 millimeters, 40 caliber approximately. You look up the numbers. You do the math. And lots of companies produced ammunition that was for a specific rifle that people couldn't have, but the gun was good, but the gun wasn't made anymore. So people would have a new gun made. Louis Christophe and other companies would do custom orders. So this guy could have ended up with a gun with very strange characteristics, which means it would be impossible to even figure out what the hell it was chambered for. For instance, on his page, he calls this the rimmed Douglas cartridge because he decided that the person who did the the article in 1969, Duncan Douglas Jr., the website I'm stealing this from, had just essentially invented a new cartridge. Yeah. And it's the 425 Douglas rimmed cartridge, the 4406, instead of the 30-06. So I'll include that in the title too. This is inspired by, again, Major George Charles Nonte, I want to say Monte, Jr., and his cartridge conversion book that I can't even afford to look at. Meanwhile, the same person there that I just mentioned, I'll leave a link to one entire page of nothing but a book that's just published openly. It's a crapshoot whether you're going to find these things cheap, free, or at all. Same thing with the guns. But I think the contention that it was ever chambered for 410 or rechambered is a bit weird. Anyway, he tried out 444 Marlin and a bunch of other cases that I've talked about on YouTube videos and also made note of to make full-length brass 410 shells, including 30-06 putting a rim on it, or a ring on it. Anyway, so what are the other methods for attaching a rim to a cartridge? I'll just start with a 50 BMG converted to 12 gauge from hell cartridges. You grind off the rim edge, which again, it's got a little right angle thing to it to have an extractor pull the cartridge out. It only has to work once. It's presumed you're not going to reload it. Grinding that off and then threading it and then putting on a metal piece that's threaded with the opposite pattern onto it and then grinding that down to be the correct size by running it on a lathe. Now let's list the problems with that. With this guy, he's mushing the metal onto it without anything providing any abrasiveness or bonding capability, so it would not be able to work on a mill very easily. You'd want to pin it, or solder it, or weld it, or anything other than what he's talking about. However, would it work if you could trim it cleanly, safely, properly to make cartridges, and would it work well? Because you're basically extending the rim, the extractor rim, out to be the real rim of the cartridge. Yes, this is more practical than anything I've ever seen. You'd have to make the brass you're putting onto it annealed. You wouldn't have to heat up the brass for the case, so you wouldn't have to compromise it. You could load it up to full pressure, for instance, because you didn't heat it up. And you mash and swage in a rim that's normally treated, at least in double rifles and in shotguns, as just something to make it to where it doesn't fall into the chamber too far, because it's a straight-walled cartridge. In fact, this is eminently desirable for it. Interesting. And yes, there's 40 caliber nitro expresses and stuff this could have been made for, but we don't know because this is an old article and I can't find any data about the guy. Now I want to bring up something else. Semi-rimmed or rimless cartridges sometimes get snap rings or moon clips put on them so they can be used in guns that want to have rims on them. This is very common, but they're temporary. Some people will seal them with Loctite or put a circ clip on it or whatever, or something else to give it a rim. You can also use non-annealing temperatures for particular types of solder that melt at very low temperatures, like something up to 15,000 psi strength tin silver solder, or just eutectic 63% tin solders to bond them. The other one is to coat things with a liberal layer of tinning flux and hit it with a torch, because that usually melts at a much lower temperature than it would cause annealing in the brass. And of course, all of these were re-swaged after annealing the mouths to make them straight-walled and stuff. So, what is this video about? Yet another method to add a rim to a cartridge, if you want to, that can be permanent. And in this case, if you could get it to swage correctly, I would recommend just using copper at this point and not modifying the cartridge, although they cut a V in it on the outside edge. I'd recommend squeezing it in with just copper and just using it as just a permanently installed circlip or moon clip. Do I feel that this would work better than using solder or threading it or both? The amount of work described? Maybe. It would be doable on an industrial scale. Just saying. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with it.